To everyone online, once again, apologize for my camera not working. That was a surprise. And bonjour à toutes et tous ici ce soir. So tonight, as Francoise said, I'm going to be speaking in English primarily, but I'm going to pause from time to time to give short summaries in French. I want to keep the momentum going, so I'm not going to do a word-for-word translation. Alors ce soir, je vais principalement parler en anglais, mais je vais faire des brefs résumés, des brefs sommaires en français pour tout le monde. Je veux que ça bouge un petit peu, alors je pense que je ne vais pas traduire ma présentation dans son intégralité, mais je suis toujours heureux de répondre aux questions en français si vous le voulez. But I want to begin tonight with a question. How does artwork change the way that we understand a story? Par exemple, comment l'animation peut changer notre façon de comprendre et de raconter des histoires? Whether it's a children's book, a textbook, or a graphic novel, I would argue that one of the advantages of visual storytelling is that artwork can make a narrative more engaging or tangible, and it can also simplify and communicate complexity to new audiences using visual shorthand. And animation as a medium is very good at doing both of those things. And that is the starting point and guiding motivation for everything that I'm going to be talking about tonight. Now, the Animated History of Tibet is a project that I am writing and co-producing together with Tibet House US in the United States. And tonight I want to talk you, bien sûr. And tonight I can talk you through the entire series, the stages of production, storyboarding, animation, post-production, the entire creative process, and also discuss our motivation for producing this series, why we think that visual storytelling is so important and public-facing education is so important right now, as well as the value that it can bring to Tibetan studies. Je veux vous guider à travers l'intégralité de la série, les étapes de production, scénario, animation, post-production, le processus créatif, et aussi de discuter la valeur que l'animation peut apporter actuellement aux études tibétaines. But first, what is the Animated History of Tibet? Yes. This is a 9-part, fully animated historical documentary series that will cover the majority of Tibetan history, starting in the 7th century with the rise of the Tibetan Empire, and then finishing over 1,300 years later in 1963 with the drafting of the Constitution of Tibet in exile, and with a brief survey of the Tibetan diaspora today. Now, the series will be free to watch on YouTube, our YouTube channel, Armchair Academics. And the first episode is going to air on the 10th of February, 2023, with Tibetan and then Mandarin language versions coming out later in the year, probably in the autumn, if we're lucky. Alors, l'histoire animée du Tibet est une série documentaire historique entièrement animée en 9 parties qui couvrent la majorité de l'histoire du Tibet à partir du 7e siècle et se terminant en 1963 avec la signature de la Constitution du Tibet. La série sera gratuite à regarder sur notre chaîne YouTube, Armchair Academics, et elle sortira en anglais en février avec des versions en tibétain et mandarin plus tard pendant l'automne, probablement, si j'ai de la chance. Now, I'll return to the Tibetan and Mandarin language versions and some of the difficulties that they pose and the funding we need to finish them in a moment. But first, why make an animated history of Tibet at all? What does a project like this bring to the community? Leaving aside the profit motive, I do run a small educational video production company, and we benefit from making content that people enjoy, want to share and learn from. But leaving that aside, there are several reasons, several answers to that question, the most important of which has to do with YouTube itself and the visibility of Tibetan voices and Tibetan content creators on YouTube. Now, YouTube is the second largest search engine in the world, right after Google. As of last month, it had 2.5 billion active users, and one of the fastest growing sectors on the platform is education and educational resources. And the thing is, accurate Tibet-related content is very difficult to find. Malgré le fait que YouTube soit l'un des plus grands moteurs de recherche au monde, le contenu relatif au Tibet est encore assez difficile de trouver. Et mélanger ce contenu, il existe de nombreuses vidéos qui reflètent les récits de l'État chinois. Il y a plusieurs raisons pour cela. Now, I won't bore you with analytics, I promise, but even where Tibet-related content exists, YouTube's algorithm, that's the program that decides what to show you as a viewer, rates keywords like free Tibet, the annexation of Tibet, or invasion of Tibet very low, which makes them almost invisible unless you're looking for those things specifically. And this image here, this is a screenshot of a search that I did this morning just for the words, the keyword liberation of Tibet. And we can come back to this if anyone has any questions later. It's very interesting, the results, but not necessarily relevant to what I'm talking about tonight. And the YouTube algorithm has no way to tell the difference between legitimate history and investigative journalism or the partisan history done, for example, by Chinese state actors living outside of China. It takes all of those things and kind of squishes them together. And if you search for Tibetan history, it then promotes to you the videos that have the highest engagement. In other words, that have the most comments, likes, and shares, which usually are videos that reflect current Chinese state narratives. And this is a problem. And it's probably no coincidence. I would argue that it is a consequence of an informational strategy used by many state actors and private interest groups to influence the flow of discourse on social media platforms. But there are things that we can do to begin to change that, to raise the visibility of Tibet-related content, and by doing that, raise the visibility of Tibetan voices on the platform while providing a well-researched Tibetan history that is accurate enough to be of service to the Tibetan Studies community as a resource, and also visually compelling enough to pique the interest of consumers or broadly interested in world history. That's our mission statement. That's my elevator pitch. Et ce que nous essayons de faire, c'est d'accroître la visibilité des contenus relatifs au Tibet et ce faisant aussi d'accroître la visibilité des voix tibétaines sur la plateforme et de fournir également une histoire bien documentée du Tibet qui est aussi visuellement attrayante pour intéresser un public diversifié. Ça, c'est le but du projet. Now, there are other reasons for doing this, both personal and... Sorry, there's someone speaking in there. Sorry. Oh, sorry. We're trying to mute people's. I'm not the host, so I don't have any control here. Sorry. Now, there are other reasons for making the project, both personal and professional, that I'm happy to talk about if there are questions. And I'm also happy to talk about YouTube data and analytics if anyone's interested. But I want to move on to the development of the series, the production of the series, so you can see where we are right now, how the work is being done, and who we are, which is a very good place to start. Who are we? So this is the team. I'll be talking about them, kind of what you know, one of them, that's me. You can't see me on the camera, but Alexander Smith is me. So moving sort of left to right, top to bottom, like we were reading a text. Sarah Amber is an Ulaanbaatar-based artist. She's a Mongolian artist who works out of South Korea, formerly South Korea. She's our head animator, so she's doing a lot of the organizational work and management that goes into animation. And she's also doing all of the character animation. So all the people that you see moving and interacting in our videos, that's all her work. I am the writer, narrator, director, and co-producer of the project. I'm responsible for all the fundraising, and I'm working together with Sarah to direct this series and organize all of the visuals. Junio is another Ulaanbaatar-based artist. He's doing all of the backgrounds that you see. We'll talk a lot about the background animations in the series. These are the static images that you'll see. Tenzin Gyurme is a Dharamsala-based artist, and he's primarily a studio artist. But he's working for us doing what we call map paintings, so also 2D background illustrations, and he's doing a lot of the promotional artwork for this series, little illustrations to make things feel a bit more, I don't know, it's just a bit more engaging. Tyrell Massey on the bottom left is our audio person. He's fixing up the audio and designing what he calls an audio landscape, just making things sound very nice. Bayarbat is our post-production animation specialist. I'll talk about post-production later. It is basically magic. It's the magic that holds everything together. But I'll explain all of that at the end. Tenzin Chöpel is our cultural consultant. He is one of my friends from Oxford, but he currently lives up in Écosse in Scotland. And if this were a $50 million Disney film, I would call him our brain trust. But I can't hire, a team of 50 people to make sure that all of the costumes are accurate and that the locations look accurate. So I'm relying on Tenzin for a lot of the, not historical accuracy necessarily, but the accuracy of the images that we're creating, that they feel authentic enough to both Westerners and Tibetans. And Wouter Goodkop is a Canadian, and he's doing all of the maps for the series. And the maps are incredible. Absolutely incredible. So I'll be talking a lot about those later. But that is the team, ça c'est l'équipe, quoi. Pardon, j'ai fait ça en anglais, tout simplement, je suis désolé, mais nous pouvons revenir si vous avez des questions sur l'équipe ou des personnages et tout cela. Bon. The pre-production process, how does something like this begin? So the pre-production process begins with the team doing a workshop on material culture. So Tenzin Chöpel and I spent a lot of time with Sarah Amber determining the basic elements of costume design that needed to be present to help us represent the main characters in each episode. And once we selected some basic design elements unique to each character, the artist went to work building models for the main characters in the narrative and designing background characters for each of the major factions in the series. That was actually quite a bit more work than I thought. Alors, le processus de pré-production a commencé par l'organisation d'un atelier sur la culture matérielle. Nous avons sélectionné quelques éléments visuels dans l'iconographie et la culture matérielle tibétaine pour représenter les personnages principaux de l'histoire. Et nous avons toujours essayé de trouver un pont entre l'iconographie tibétaine traditionnelle et les conventions de dessins animés occidentaux. For example, Songtsen Gampo's iconic white turban is an easily identifiable aspect of his traditional iconography. And for our purposes, this serves as visual shorthand that helps Tibetan audiences identify the character quickly, but we've tweaked its traditional representation to look a little bit less like a turban and a little bit more like a crown to convey the authority that the Tsampo has to Western audiences who might not be familiar with the concept of Tibetan kingship. So in the character design, we're trying a lot of the time to find a middle ground to bridge more traditional Tibetan artwork with the conventions of Western anime. We also had to select a style for the series. And this took a lot of time, actually. We had to select this style for the series, and you'll notice I showed earlier some of the promotional artwork. We've moved away from the promotional artwork for a variety of reasons. We workshopped the artwork at the very beginning, and we started with a very sort of accurate, a very realistic style. And that didn't read very well for a lot of the Tibetans that I was speaking with. And so in the end, we moved into more of an anime style. And I can talk about our decisions later if there are questions, because it's actually quite complicated, the choice that we made to use a Western anime style. Then the last question was to use a more painterly style of art, or to use a more anime style of art, like these two images of Tongtsen Gampo here. In the end, this was entirely economic. We just ran out of money, basically. We didn't have the money to do the more painterly aesthetic style. And so we've settled on a very simple 2D anime style, which is very economical, very fast to animate. Alors, nous avons modifié notre style initial depuis la phase de promotion du projet, après avoir reçu les commentaires d'un groupe de discussion. Et ce que nous avons choisi finalement est beaucoup plus proche de l'anime occidental. Et je peux discuter notre choix plus tard si vous avez des questions. So we have, in the style that we've chosen in the artwork that we're making, we have two major inspirations. Nous sommes inspirés par deux choses en particulier. The first is one of my favorite animated series is Avatar: The Last Airbender. So we, don't have $500,000 per episode, right? So we can't quite achieve the same level of artwork, in particular the shadows that appear here, right? That give the faces depth and contours. That costs a lot and takes a lot of time in animation. We just simply can't do that. But we're still very inspired by the material culture of the show and by the character animations. The second major inspiration is Kurosawa's film Ran. This is the last sort of masterpiece made by Akira Kurosawa. And what we're interested here primarily is how Kurosawa uses affinity of color, so contrasting colors to convey factions and alliances. So you can always tell what factions characters belong to, what factions soldiers belong to, because they always share the same colors. And affinity of color shows alliances, and contrasting color shows antagonism, conflict. And we're using that in the series as a kind of visual shorthand to try to convey aspects of Tibetan history that we don't have the time to explain. Alors, dans notre travail artistique, nous sommes inspirés par deux choses en particulier. La première est Avatar: The Last Airbender, la série animée. Les modèles des personnages sont toujours une source d'inspiration majeure. Et la seconde est la façon, I'm just going to run that again while I talk here. La seconde est la façon dans laquelle nous utilisons les couleurs pour représenter les différentes factions de la série. Nous essayons d'utiliser l'affinité des couleurs et les couleurs contrastées comme raccourci visuel, si ça fait le sens, comme raccourci visuel pour représenter les factions alliées et les conflits entre les empires et les clans différents tibétaines. Another important part of the pre-production process for us was script writing, of course. I could talk about this all day, I won't. But the only thing that I want to touch on here is the way that we've divided up the episodes in a general sense, because this does also reflect my understanding of Tibetan history as a Western historian, and my sort of orientation and biases are something that I'm very happy to talk about. But if anyone has any specific questions about episodes, we can pull up an episode list and talk through them later. But in a very general sense, the first three episodes will cover the rise and fall of the Tibetan Empire, the so-called Dark Age and the Tibetan Renaissance, finishing with the formation of the Sarma schools. Episodes 4 and 5 cover Tibet during the Yuan period and the rise of the Pagmadrupa dynasty, and then finish with the establishment of the Ganden Podrong. Episode 6, 7, and 8 then do everything up to 1948. That's a bit of a mad dash. There's a lot of ground to cover in the 18th century in particular. And the final episode focuses on the events of 1949 to 1959, and then finishes in the modern Tibetan diaspora. And obviously, Tibetan history does not end there. But for reasons that I'm happy to discuss, we chose to end the series in 1963. But if all of this is successful, there's no reason to not continue making animated content on Tibet and or Buddhist histories more broadly. And there's tons of subjects that we could go into more deeply than we do in the series. So if this is a success, this could just be the start. Alors, si vous avez des questions spécifiques sur les épisodes de la série, par exemple, sur mon point de vue, pardon, si vous avez des questions sur des épisodes spécifiques de la série, ou par exemple sur mon point de vue en tant qu'historien et scénariste, n'hésite pas de me demander. Je suis par exemple un chercheur en sciences sociales laïques, et cela a influencé ma perspective historique, naturellement, et la manière dans laquelle je choisis de représenter les événements historiques. Mais on continue. After all of that, s'il vous plaît. After all of that, we storyboard the series. And I probably have the least to say about storyboarding, but this is pretty much where all of the major choices regarding shot composition, movement, and the visual structure of the series are made. So it's all very important, but not necessarily interesting for the purposes of this talk. Now, while we were storyboarding, what is very important for the talk tonight is that we are also producing a variety of different maps, for this series. And this is something that I want to talk about and sort of shine a light on. Alors, nous faisons beaucoup de cartes et je vais le discuter, expliquer notre choix par un moment. So we are making, this is like a production map, not a production map, this is a promotional map. It's not actually going to appear in the series. But now I run a business, and so I'm doing things like selling this in my online store. Donc, je suis vraiment désolé, mais voilà. So we are making 3 types of maps, sort of in particular. Is that going to go? Did I click it? Yes. The first are isometric city maps. That's a 3/4 view of locations, cities, fortresses, monasteries. We're trying to cover a lot of the most visually interesting locations, but also major historical locations in a relatively high level of detail. All of our maps try to represent locations between 1900 and 1939, because a lot of the visual material that we have to pull from comes from, we like it or not, the Young Husband expedition, and then later Ernst Schaeffer's expedition to Tibet, 1938 and 1939, the German expedition. So all of our city maps basically are in that historical period. And I can talk about how we've made them later. We're also making regional maps of the areas that surround the Tibetan plateau. This is our Indian map, a cross-section of our Indian map. And let's see. Yes, this is our Eastern China map. There's not too much to say about these really, but we've tried to map the entire Tibetan plateau and the area around the plateau in the series style. And then we're making a kind of insane map. So this is an incredibly high def map of the Tibetan plateau. And we've made this in 6 different historical periods. So the location markers, the geography, the landscape, cities, monasteries, fortresses all change over time. They're destroyed, they're rebuilt. And so many of the location markers will change and grow or vanish, right? Lost, you have actually Khotan here, which is ruined now, lost in the desert. So it's a map that will change and evolve throughout the course of the series. Now, let's see, we have 2 main inspirations. I'll return to, je vais discuter tout cela en français juste un moment. But we have 2 main inspirations for the style in our map making. This is something that a lot of people have asked questions about. The first is Western fantasy map making. So there are many different styles now in Western fantasy map making, but traditional Western fantasy map making goes back to this map made by Christopher Tolkien, who is the son of J.R.R. Tolkien, a map of Middle Earth. And our style is very much influenced by this traditional way of map making. So you'll notice sort of the way that maps are represented, rivers, forests, we draw from that very much. But we always try to find a bridge, un pont entre Tibetan and Western art. And so the other sort of major inspiration is the Wise collection. There's a lot to say about this. It's a very interesting collection of maps, but these are a series of maps that are in the British Museum that were commissioned in the 1850s by Thomas Alexander Wise. And we don't know, unfortunately, who the Tibetan artist was, but we know that they were all made by one artist who was working on this commission from the British Raj, Thomas Wise being an agent of the British Raj. So one of the things that we find compelling about these is the way that locations are represented, fortresses, monasteries, and things. And they're always larger or smaller depending on their cultural importance and sort of their historical importance. And so that's something that we also draw from and convey in our maps. The most important locations tend to be a little bit bigger, and then, the less important locations tend to sort of diminish in size. Alors, notre travail cartographique est inspiré par deux choses en particulier. La première est une tradition occidentale de cartographie fantastique qui remonte à la célèbre carte de Middle-earth faite par Christopher Tolkien. Notre façon de représenter les paysages cartographiques, les montagnes, les rivières, prairies, toutes les caractéristiques géographiques du plateau tibétain sont inspirées par cette tradition. Le deuxième est la cartographie tibétaine primordiale, dans lesquelles les villes, les monastères, les châteaux sont très souvent représentés par les grands emplacements dessinés à la main. Et la taille de ces emplacements est souvent plus ou moins grande en fonction de l'importance relative de la localité. Alors, une fois de plus, nous essayons de trouver un pont entre deux traditions artistiques et de les adapter au style de la Syrie. Now, despite the fact that we are drawing a lot of inspiration from fantasy map making, we want our maps to reflect a very high level of historical fidelity. We want them to be accurate. Having accurate maps is extremely important because map making is often used as a source of propaganda. And this is honestly something that you'll see all the time in YouTube, particularly whenever you see maps of the Qing dynasty on YouTube. So redrawing or blurring borders or misrepresenting the relationship between neighboring factions, for example, is a very easy way for state actors to create modern revisionist history and shift public perception of historical events. This is particularly true in the case of Tibet. So we try to be as accurate as possible. I'm going to replay that map while I talk here. Apologies. We try to be as historically accurate as possible when we represent the territory controlled by political factions. And when we draw borders, those are based on our readings of primary sources and on reliable secondary sources. Another thing that we try to convey in our maps is that landscape plays a very important role in Tibetan history. The movement of trade, people, goods, all historically depended on things like river valleys, mountain passes, and high altitude lakes, and the availability of oases. Water plays a huge role in determining the Himalayas. So we've kind of overemphasized the size of bodies of water. They take up a disproportionate amount of space, or I should say an amount of space proportional to their importance. Alors, l'exactitude historique de nos cartes est également très importante pour nous, même si on utilise un style fantastique. Alors, lorsque nous représentons le territoire contrôlé par les factions politiques et lorsque nous traçons des frontières, celles-ci sont déterminées par nos lectures des sources primaires et sur des sources secondaires fiables qui seront toujours disponibles comme des références dans les descriptions des vidéos sur YouTube. Nos vidéos seront donc toujours étayées par des références accessibles de ces sources primaires et secondaires. Ça, c'est quelque chose qui reste très important. So the final part of pre-production that I'll mention is that we're shooting a number of interviews with Tibetologists and historians to use as a supplement in each episode. These are still not complete, unfortunately. Organizing these has actually been the most difficult part of the series due to our limited budget and the limited availability of the people that we'd like to speak to, but we're moving in a chronological order, and I'm still plan to integrate those into this series. Now, moving on to the production itself. The most important visual component of the work is, of course, the animation. And the way that animation works, for those of you that don't know, is that the artwork is done in multiple different layers, separately and then combined or rendered together. We have two artists, Tenzin Gyurme and Junio, working, for example, on the background animations. These are all of these static or mostly static images that you'll see throughout the series, the landscape, the urban environments, the buildings, and we have to workshop these as well to make sure that they are either historically accurate or, in the case of actual historical locations like Samye Monastery, that they read as culturally faithful and believable to Tibetan audiences when we're designing them. For instance, this is what we're calling our tsomchen. Tsomchen, like not a living room, a reception room, or tsomchen, a reception room. Where emperors sit and debate things with their ministers or with allied aristocratic leaders. And you have to build the space to exist in multiple different times, in daytime, night, in the winter and summer, whatever, so that you have maximum utility for the character animators. Here's a similar thing. For example, this is our throne room for the Tang dynasty, where we go back many times in the first 3 episodes. And we've even, we cheat a little bit, we're redesigning the color scheme so that we can reuse the same space in later episodes for different dynasties in China. So we're working on a very limited budget. So the economy of the art becomes very, very important. Alors, l'animation, ou le type d'animation 2D que nous faisons est réalisé en plusieurs niveaux qui sont ensuite combinés en post-production. Et le premier niveau est animation de fondre ou animation en arrière-plan, peut-être. Et nous avons également organisé un atelier pour garantir l'exactitude historique et la fidélité culturelle de notre animation de fondre, qui était nécessaire parce qu'il y a certaines choses comme les cérémonies d'intronisation des empereurs tibétains qui ne sont pas bien représentées dans les œuvres d'art ou forcément décrites avec précision dans les textes contemporains. Et nous avons donc utilisé un certain montant de créativité dans la conception de ces éléments. Now, in designing these things, as a side note, one of the challenges that we faced in narrating the Tibetan Empire in particular was how do you represent things for which there is no visual record in Tibetan material culture? Oathing ceremonies, for example, during the enthronement of an emperor, where members of major clan factions, aristocrats, and regional warlords would swear oaths to the temple. These things served a very important function in the political life of the imperial Tibetan state. But what did they look like? And how can we represent them in a way that is simultaneously, I'm just going to keep playing that loop there, I'm sorry, that is simultaneously visually interesting and still within our budget. So this is our enthronement of Tsongtsen Gampo, for example, but the same thing is true of the signing of treaties and treaty negotiations during the imperial period. What do they look like? Now, in animating these things, we've had to kind of play some jazz and create scenes that create scenes from scratch because the material and textual cultural record is very sparse. And my hope is that our representations of those things can serve to foster a historically informed discourse, even if that is nitpicking our choices and the aspects of material culture that we've chosen to emphasize. If our creative work can serve as a visual reference, visual centerpiece for informed historical discussion, then we're doing our job, the job of raising the visibility of discourse on Tibetan history and Tibetan visual culture online. Et ce que j'espère est que nos représentations de ces événements, pour lesquels nous n'avons pas forcément des références visuelles, peuvent contribuer à générer un nouveau discours historiquement informé, à la fois en ligne et dans les salles de classe. Ça, c'est aussi un des buts. Now, returning to the production process here, once the background animations are done, or at least the black and white lines are done, we do character animations. And this is done mostly by Sarah Amber, and it's a lot for her to do on her own, but we take the character models that we built during the pre-production process and we animate them. First with simple line work, and then when that's keyed in and looking good, we begin to add color to flesh it out and make it feel a bit more alive. And that's when all of the pre-production workshopping of material culture, of patterns, fashion, hairstyles, all of that begins to take shape and becomes important. Alors, la deuxième étape, très simplement, est l'animation des personnages qui est placée au-dessus de l'arrière-plan. Et cela commence par des simples lignes que nous animons et quand nous sommes heureux, nous ajoutons de la couleur. C'est pas forcément un process compliqué, mais ça peut être très chronophage, en particulier pour une petite équipe. So after all of that, we go into post-production. And this is audio balancing and audio design, post-production animation, adding little animatics, little animated elements and flourishes to the background to breathe some life into them, animating all of the design elements on the maps, for example. That is Bayar's job, and he's a wizard. I'm constantly amazed by his work, but there's one aspect here that I would like to emphasize, and that is the narration process and the Tibetan and Mandarin language versions of the series that we're trying to create. Now, I'm doing all of the narration for that's me again, for those of you online. I'm doing all of the narration for the English language version myself. That is a cost-cutting measure. I'm not a professional narrator, but we are planning to re-release the series fully narrated in both Tibetan and Mandarin. That'll be time-consuming and expensive, and we'll have to do more fundraising. But yes, the goal is to have that done. So sorry, I'm skipping ahead in my notes. Yes, so we're going to be running a second fundraising campaign, probably in February or March. It's one of the reasons I hand out little flyers in the room here, and I would encourage you at home to visit our website. You can see our website up in the corner there, or follow us on Instagram, YouTube, whatever, but to keep track of the project's production, because we are going to need to run another fundraising campaign to finance the Tibetan and Mandarin language versions. Yes, so je suis le narrateur de la version anglaise de la série, mais nous allons également organiser une campagne de financement fin de février ou mars pour financer les versions tibétaines et mandarin de la série. Ça, c'est pourquoi j'ai distribué des petites dépliantes avec des liens de nos réseaux sociaux. Comme ça, vous pouvez suivre l'évolution du projet et si vous êtes intéressé et si vous souhaitez soutenir la traduction entre anglais et tibétain et mandarin l'année prochaine. Now this, to me personally, is one of the most important parts of what we are trying to do. And I might wax a little bit poetic here, but there are significant Tibetan-speaking and also Mandarin-speaking audiences who would get very little value from it if it were only released in English. On the one hand, from a market perspective, I have to think that way. That gives us access to those audiences, which is always a good thing. But on the other hand, multilingual support makes this a much more flexible educational resource that can communicate a rigorous historical narrative of Tibet that might not otherwise be accessible to those audiences. Now, YouTube is not available in China, not officially anyway, but that doesn't mean that there is no interest. When I was teaching Tibetan history, sort of, it's not a super long talk. I'm starting to move into my conclusion a bit. But when I was teaching Tibetan history in Germany, my classrooms were full of Chinese expats, of Chinese students living outside of the PRC. And many of them were sincerely interested in learning more about Tibet and in challenging the tropes and stereotypes propagated by the Chinese state media. And that was very often in good faith. So there is space, I think, to shift the narrative, although it's sometimes hard to see. There's also a largely untapped market demand for Tibetan stories to be told. Now, there is a new generation of Tibetan content creators on platforms like YouTube who are doing this through different forms of media and different fields. But what we also need, I think, is for their Western colleagues and collaborators to make good marketable media to raise the visibility of Tibetan content. And that is a niche, I think, that this fulfills. Now, there's a lot more that I could say. I was also planning to talk about my sort of historical perspective, my background as a historian, and the ways in which this could be an educational resource. I have a lot of ideas for that. And I'll return to that if there are no questions or if the questions don't take us there. But I thought maybe, since that's a sort of good introduction to the project, I thought maybe I would open it up to questions. And then if we have time, if we come back to it, then we will sort of talk about how I see this being used as an educational resource. Alors, oui, qu'est-ce que vous pensez? C'est ouvert aux questions, si ça marche? OK, parfait, parfait. Donc, merci tout le monde.